with the details of the investigation. I'm going to introduce some people that are going to be speaking, as well as some special guests that are here. In addition to myself, the speakers will be Sergeant Zach Storment. He is also of the Major Crimes Unit for the Spokane Police Department. We have Othram CEO David Middleton and Chief Craig Meidel of the Spokane Police Department. They'll be speaking to you in sequence. Our special guest today, our former retired prosecutor, Frank Johnson. Thank you, Frank. Frank was a young prosecutor at the time that this terrible tragedy occurred and worked closely with the investigators at the time. We also have retired Captain Richard Olberding. Thank you, Captain. Captain Olberding was a young patrolman working graveyard. He was held over at the end of his shift, and he was one of the 2 officers that actually found Candy Rogers' body. He mentioned to me that that image still haunts him to this day. We also have retired Detective Brian Hammond. He was the latest detective prior to Sergeant Zach Storment to work on this case, and he put a number of years into it. In addition to those 3, we have Washington State Patrol forensic scientist Brittany Wright. She worked closely with Sergeant Storment on the collection and processing of the DNA. Thank you, Brittany. I want to remind the media that we're going to take questions after the last speaker. We also have a packet of information for you at the end of the conference, which includes the video presentation that we will give here shortly. I would also ask that the special guests not be approached after the conference. If they wish to answer questions from the media, they'll come talk to you. I want to talk about how this affected the Spokane community. Certainly there were a lot of victims involved in this case over the last 62 years. Obviously, Candy Rogers is the primary victim of this incident. Nothing like this should ever happen to a child anytime, anywhere, and yet it did. Her family and friends would be considered the next victims in this case. They've had to live with this entire time, and now perhaps they can find some peace in the resolution. I would also like to add the victims list to include the law enforcement personnel. We had 3 generations of law enforcement personnel that worked on this case. And from my personal experience, when a case goes unresolved, it leaves you hollow. Fortunately, we can put an end to that as well. And lastly, we have a new victim. That would be the perpetrator's family. His children, his spouse, his distant relatives also have to now deal with the pain of what happened and how evil this incident was. And lastly, I'd like to speak directly to those individuals that perpetuate these types of heinous crimes. I want you to know that we will find you, that we are tenacious, that we'll never give up. In life or in death, you will be found. And now I'd like to introduce Sergeant Zach Storment to talk about the story of this investigation.
So I'm going to start with a video that was produced last night, and then I'll take you through the case.
A little girl, just 9 years old, out one late afternoon in 1959 selling campfire mitts, never to return. What happened to Candy Rogers? Who killed her? For 62 years, there have been plenty of tips, suspects, speculation, but until now, not one conclusive, viable suspect.
This is kind of the case that's been the giant logjam for cold cases in Spokane. It's been I keep saying it's the Mount Everest of our cold case is the one that we could never seem to overcome, but at the same time, nobody ever forgot.
Indeed, the disappearance of Candy Rogers rocked the Spokane community, and for decades remained a most talked about, investigated, and haunting case. Candy lived here in this West Central neighborhood. Her apartment was here, where the community center now stands next to Cannon Park. On the night Candy disappeared, and for an agonizing 16 days afterwards, an entire community would gather to search for her. They would find 6 boxes of campfire minutes, but no little girl. The search included a helicopter from Fairchild Air Force Base that tragically crashed while looking for Candy. 3 airmen died, 2 survived. Just more than 2 weeks after Candy's disappearance, hunters found her shoes in a remote area some 7 miles from her home. The next day, at daybreak, Spokane police would find her body beneath pine needles and brush. Candy had been raped and strangled to death with a strip of her own clothing. It was the end of the search for the young girl, a 4th grader at Holmes Elementary, but it was the beginning of a search for her killer. A massive investigative effort involving multiple law enforcement agencies was underway. There were hundreds of tips from all over the country. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into 2000, numerous Spokane police detectives picked up Candy's case, but were never able to establish probable cause for an arrest on any of a number of suspects. Then, 2021, Sergeant Zach Storment of the Spokane Police Department submits a DNA sample from Candy's clothing, preserved for 6 decades, to a forensic genealogy lab and gets a list of 3 suspects, Spokane brothers, all now deceased.
We are very fortunate that the detectives that came before us and everyone that handled that evidence did a good job preserving it so that we could be where we are today with it.
While that well-preserved DNA produced 3 suspects, detectives still had much work to do.
As advanced, as incredible as that science is, at the end of the day, it's still a tip. They give us names that are related to the sample. And in this case, it was very narrowed down. They did an incredible job getting it down to a small group.
In that small group was John Ray Hoff, the only brother who had children. Hoff committed suicide when his 4 children were young. To further the investigation, Sergeant Storment would have to connect with Hoff's children 62 years after the murder. Daughter Kathy got the phone call from Sergeant Storment several months ago, relaying that he thought she might have information on a cold case murder that would be helpful. And while Kathy was sure she couldn't be of help, when told the murderer may be her father or one of her uncles, she submitted her own DNA. Testing showed Kathy's DNA was 2.9 million times more likely related to the suspect's DNA profile than the general population, bringing detectives closer to the killer.
What's the public expect of a police department when we're not going to have court, when there's not going to be a judge or jury that decides this? I think the obligation on law enforcement is to achieve the highest level of certainty possible.
So detectives went after that next level of certainty. They obtained a search warrant, exhumed Hoff's body, and tested his DNA. The results were astonishing. Hoff's DNA was 25 quintillion times more likely to match the DNA profile developed from Candy's clothing than DNA from any unrelated person chosen at random in the U.S. population. The testing was a one-on-one comparison of the DNA from Hoff's body and the DNA recovered from Candy all those years ago. Certainty starts to sink in for Hoff's daughter, who was just 9 years old when her dad took his life, the same age as Candy when she was killed. When you finally realized it was your dad, what went through your mind?
Disbelief, but not that I didn't believe it, but it's just, it takes a while for it to like sink in. And anger, sadness. By that point, I had already looked up, someone that a little girl murdered in 1959, so I knew who it was. It's just really sad to find out that someone that, not even that it's just your dad, but just someone in your family could do something like that.
And he committed suicide.
I had lived most of my life thinking he did it because he was very depressed or something, and now I think, no. You know, he was evil. He was evil, and there was an escape away from it, but he got to die with people thinking he was an upstanding man, and he wasn't.
While Sergeant Stormont had the unenviable task of telling John Ray Hoff's children and wife Hoff was responsible for Candy's death, he also delivered the news to several of Candy's few living relatives that the murder case was solved. While the news was welcome in a bittersweet way, it also triggered emotions and memories that have been extremely difficult for Candy's cousin.
I feel like Candy's loss was just a horrible loss. She was so cute. And she didn't have much time.
There are a number of coincidences, maybe, certainly eerie connections with Candy and John Ray Hoff. They were buried in the same cemetery all these years, until recently, when Hoff's daughter and wife had moved away from the little girl's resting place. And in a book produced by the Spokane Police Department History Book Committee in 2014, the story of Candy's death and investigation is 10 pages away from a picture of John Ray Hoff. It's an unrelated story about a law enforcement identification system that happened to use Hoff's mugshot from an arrest on a case 2 years after Candy was killed. Hoff was convicted of second-degree assault with intent to rob and spent 6 months in jail. The one thread that is not a coincidence is the DNA. Both Candy's family members and Hoff's say they are extremely grateful that the DNA technology today helped solve Candy's murder, and they are hopeful the technology will help other families.
I think it means that we, as the Spokane Police Department, we see a path forward to solve more cases like this and have an effect on the volume of cold cases we have, which is quite large. We have over 110.
For now, 2 families and a community have some closure to a murder that was so hard to grasp. Candy, the campfire girl, out selling candies on a March evening in 1959. What would you like Candy and her mother to know?
I'm very, very sorry for what my dad did. That he took her life horribly, and that he took her mom's life, really, took her dad's life. He took more lives than one. And even though I didn't do it, and I'm not responsible, I mean, I wasn't even born, I hope that it gets her peace, knowing that even though it's not really justice, because he doesn't get any punishment, but that his name has this on it now, and they can know it's solved, and everybody can know it's done.
I wish that we would have known who killed her when they were still alive, her mom and dad and her grandparents. She was an only child, her mom was an only child, and so that's really sad that they passed away with not knowing who had taken their granddaughter and daughter's life. So I hope everybody's at peace now. I know that we are.
Bear with me, I'm kind of a pacer when I talk. Again, my name is Zach Storm, and I'm a sergeant with the Spokane Police Department. Even though this has been 62 years, this is still a very emotionally charged case. And we saw that last night. We've kind of battled as to how to release this massive case. And we've known now the result for about a month and a half, but as those days have progressed, more and more people have known. And for the people out there that knew Candy and were considered her a friend or a classmate or a cousin or a relative that didn't get a personal introduction to the case from me, I'm sorry for that. But we did the best we could with what we had, and the fact that this case is just a monster. Even though this happened 62 years ago, there are a lot of people still living in Spokane to live through it, and for them, this is a vivid memory. For those that don't know this case well, and because it is so old, there are many people that are going to have to hear this for the first time, and you have to be cautious, and there's no way around saying this is a violent crime against a small child that is hard to hear. For Candy, she did not make her 10th birthday. She was born on July 13th of 49, and she was described as small for her class size, only 4'4". She lived in the west central neighborhood of Spokane, Washington, which you can see on this map. 2104 pictured here is the home of her maternal grandparents, Stanley and Lita Newton. Candy lived next door. This is actually a grocery store with an apartment above. She lived upstairs there with her mother, Elaine. Stanley and Lita Newton were a big presence in the girl's life and a big part of raising her. For Candy, March 6, 1959 meant the beginning of campfire mint sales. Candy was not a campfire girl, but was aspiring to become one. She was a member of the junior member of that organization called Bluebird Girls. Candy got out of school at Holmes Elementary at the normal time and headed home. Towards her house, would stop along the way to pick up the mints that she would sell. She was such a little thing, they could only give her 7 boxes. She carried them in a little cardboard carrier. And people described her having quite the arm load, making it her way back to the house with her school books. But we do know she made it home. Her grandma talked to her for a period. She went out in the yard and played with her dog for a while. She's described as eating an oatmeal cookie. She then went next door, went upstairs to her own apartment, where she visited with Elaine's friend, Betty. And Betty actually offered to buy mints from Candy. But Candy was following the rules, and the rules required you cannot sell mints until after 4 p.m. So she then set out into her neighborhood. This map that you see now pretty much captures the area she traveled. She did go a little bit further west, but we believe this is pretty accurate. This is a picture from a GIS photo taken in 1958. We're fortunate to have these maps, and it's really just coincidence they were taken at the time. I think the next GIS maps were taken in the mid-60s or so. So this is pretty accurate to what West Central Spokane looked like at that time. We do know that Candy did visit quite a few doors that day. This is one map, one of our efforts to try to draw the route Candy took. And there's a lot of challenges in making a map like this. One is we're tracking the movements of a 9-year-old and trying to follow her logic. And it's not that she doesn't have any, it's just we're not sure what she was doing. The other part of this is before the age of having cell phones and electronic devices everywhere. So people who tried to estimate the time Candy was there really had to use TV programs and a best guess. So we have a wide range of half-hour increments. The other part of this is this neighborhood is flooded with campfire girls and Bluebird Girls selling mints at this period. Many people believe they saw Candy, but are not certain. Others are certain and are probably wrong. There's reports of Candy selling mints all over Spokane that are just not accurate. At the end of the day, the detectives really have to rely on people who had children, who knew Candy, who were at the home when she visited that door. And we'll get to this a little further down the line, but I want to draw your attention to the bottom left of that screen. Everything we discuss, and that's going to be a recurring theme in my presentation here, is the concept of certainty. If we had 10 different people go through the case file and drop this map, it's going to look different, just because of those variables I talked about. But myself, having read this and gone through it many times, I believe Candy is reasonably alive at 6:30 p.m. on the 2100 block of West Maxwell. So one of the hard and fast rules that Candy had in her home was that she was supposed to be home before dark all the time. That didn't have to be told to her every night. Darkness on March 6, 1959, and every year, of course, falls at 5:42 p.m. We know that Candy's alive at this point, because there are people who knew her that confirmed this. So she wasn't home on time, but her family became concerned. So by about 6 p.m., Grandpa Newton and friends and neighbors begin looking for her. Mom begins looking as well. And this quickly grows into a bigger and bigger search. Eventually, police are notified, and Spokane Police Department officers and Spokane County Sheriff's deputies and civil defense volunteers respond to the area to begin looking for Candy. The man pictured below is Inspector Piper. He was a central part of this search for the 16 days that followed looking for Candy. I believe an inspector at that time is probably the equivalent of a lieutenant. I'm not sure about that. Of course, we know Candy was not found, and by 9 p.m. that night, campfire mint boxes were being found along Pettit Drive, and I'm going to refer to this map over here. Again, the reference to Candy's home. The green dot represents where Inspector Piper set up a roadblock that night and sort of a command post. The orange dots refer to my best efforts to place where the mints were found. Unfortunately, I can't be very accurate in that, and I again go back to the concept of certainty. That's my best effort. But they do indicate a path that she's being taken. I have to go back a little bit and say that night, they're not entirely certain they're Candy's mints. That takes a while to get that confidence, and they had a count to deal with. They finally found that Candy did successfully sell 1 box of mints. The other 6 were found along this route, and I believe by that night they had pretty good certainty that these are Candy's and something terrible has happened. The cardboard carrier she was using to carry those mints was also found sitting upright along the road. It's an interesting side note that I can't add much clarity to, but the mints were found on both sides of the road. And I know that some people would like to think that Candy fought and maybe was throwing them out the window to draw attention to the situation. I don't know. I can't shed any light on that, and I don't know that we ever will be able to. This is a picture of those mints, and they're actually, the very mints are on display over here in the box, in the glass case. So by the next morning, all of Spokane is becoming aware of this, and this begins a series of efforts by the Spokesman Review and the Spokane Daily Chronicle to document this incident. And the Spokesman Review's archive is an absolute wealth of information in this. The pictures alone can help you better understand the case, and I've referred to it often. This is one of the first articles they produced. This triggered a response in our community that I doubt will ever be equaled. A command post was set up at the bottom of Pettit Drive, and that's near this dot here. That command post stayed there for many days. There's a point where people could have observed many different uniforms coming in. I have some of them listed here: Air Force, Marines, Washington Water Power, United States Postal Service, Inland Paper. People from every station in life came to help Candy. There are incredible articles written at this time, published in both papers, documenting the search efforts that were taken. The Marine Corps handled searching everywhere north of Charles Road Dam all the way to Tum Tum. Aircraft were in the air, people were on horseback. People that showed up on foot and didn't have a means to get to a search area were put on the back of police motorcycles and driven to a new search grid. That River Canyon pictured in that map was searched extensively. There are a couple of features in this map, this is 1958 again, that are probably foreign to people in Spokane now. This is actually Fort George Wright. It extends all the way down to here. That base at that point is in the process of being decommissioned, so there's many empty buildings there. But those buildings were checked more than once, and I believe the FBI helped with that. This area down here is called Natatorium Park. That area was checked extensively as well. That's a amusement park, for lack of a better word. There's a giant swimming pool, roller coaster, and that type of thing. Both of those structures or places are really different now, of course. Despite everyone's best efforts, Candy's not being found, and I'm still talking about March 7th. And as if things are not bad enough at that point, this is a picture depicting the actual helicopter that came to help. Fairchild deployed this helicopter on March 7th. This picture is taken at the parade grounds, again, at Fort George Wright. And there's stories of the crew trying to get Inspector Piper to fly, and he did not want to. He seemed to have a fear of flying. Unfortunately, that helicopter took off to fly the River Canyon and struck high tension wires over 9 Mile Reservoir and went into the water. It's a terrible situation, but if there is a bright side to it, because so many people were out looking for Candy, there were a lot of people along the shore already, and it's fairly shallow there. Boats were launched and 2 men were saved. 3 did not survive, of course. I've tried to find pictures of these 3 airmen who were lost. They are Airman Marlise D. Ray, Staff Sergeant William A. McDonald, and Lieutenant Kenneth D. Fautek. I just don't know much about them, and I wish I knew more. This is a picture of the helicopter being dragged back to shore that night. The two men who did survive, James L. Fisher and Michael Holloway, I've tried to find them, and I was unsuccessful with James Fisher. But Michael Holloway is still alive and well today, retired in Arizona. And I hope he's at home watching. Again, more pictures from the Spokesman Review, and this is a picture on the right that I hadn't seen until very recently. A picture of Elaine Rogers with her daughter Candy. This is a picture, a snapshot on the left of the command post set up at the bottom of Pettit Drive. So the search goes on for 16 days, unsuccessfully, and obviously hope has to be fading to some degree. But what is remarkable, volunteer efforts sometimes are short-lived, but the dedication here is it's really staggering. On the final weekend, 1,200 people came to the command post to help with the search. That's an incredible number by any standard. Of course, we know because we're here today that this did not end well. On March 21st, 2 airmen who were off duty took some time to go hunting off of Old Trails Road. They're on about the 5100 block. They noticed a pair of child's shoes placed near a tree and did not think much of it at the time. They left them there and continued on their way, eventually made it back to base, but the conversation continued. And eventually it was suggested that we need to call the police about this because they could be related to that little girl. And of course that was done. The police contacted them, and the police arranged to search that the next morning at first light. And graveyard officers were piled into cars and taken to that area, and we have one of those men here today. Not far from where the shoes were found, one of those men noticed a knee sticking out of the brush pile, and Candy had been discovered. The search was over, and of course had not ended well. This picture was retaken, I believe, a few days later, but it captures that. For the forensic-minded people, note the inspector and other man there holding the shoes without gloves or any type of protection. That's just a sign of the times, a different time. So this is a map. Pardon me while I switch these out a little bit. This is a modern map. This is Spokane as it exists today. For reference, where we started in West Central Spokane, that original command post, and the spots where the men were found. Up here we go to the 5100 block of Old